It's my great pleasure to introduce two remarkable people who have been immersed in Jewish-Christian involvement. The first speaker, who I'll introduce, and then I'll introduce Mary just before she speaks. The first speaker is Jonathan Gorsky, and I think there's a theme from now on. All of the last lot of talks have got London stars in them, so that's nice. And Jonathan teaches at Heathrow College and has taught there since 2008. And in terms of, I wasn't shaving when I first heard Jonathan, but I think it was while I used to teach in London. And I remember thinking, if I could hear a Jewish angel speak, this is probably what it would be like, because it was so beautifully precise and to the point and illuminating, and with such grace and joy. So you're in for a treat, and then we will have our next speaker. Actually, they've kind of got together a bit here, responding to the initial presentation. So please welcome Jonathan Gorsky.
Thank you very much for that exceedingly daunting introduction. It's always very difficult when one receives such a fulsome introduction that one knows one is not going to live up to, and coping with the letdown that might follow. But we will try. Firstly, it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to be invited to speak to a conference on Ecclesiam Suam, which was, it seems, the founding moment of dialogue as a Catholic outlook on the world, as a Catholic approach to the world. I am gradually beginning to appreciate just how significant Ecclesiam Suam is, and the remarkable and extraordinary role of Pope Paul VI, who, as one who looks at these matters from the outside, I think he has been somewhat overshadowed by his great successors. But to appreciate that the matters that bring us all together were really founded, if you like, or given initial impetus in Ecclesiam Suam, how truly important that document is. And it is a privilege for me to be invited to participate in this conference. Now, we have, I think, travelled far since Ecclesiam Suam in Catholic Jewish and Christian Jewish relations. They merit but a very brief word in Ecclesiam Suam, but it is a word that unpacking, as in all of these matters, yields profound truths. When we are spoken of as Jews, are spoken of as the people of the Old Testament, what exactly does that mean? What does it imply? Again, it is rather daunting that if I address this conference, I'm instantly associated with the Old Testament and expected to personify all that is within. Again, apologies in advance, and thank you for your patience. I wouldn't claim to be adequate to that task either. But when we see where dialogue is today, and how precious it is. And I would like to reflect briefly on an approach to Christian Jewish, or Catholic Jewish in particular, relations that I have developed, standing, I have to say, on the shoulders of giants. Most of my paper is derived from the work of scholars and theologians over the past 40 or 50 years. And my own task is simply to try to bring into the domain of Christian-Jewish relations all that they have given us. So I don't claim any originality, although the first draft of my paper has yet to appear with footnotes, which I apologize. That doesn't mean that it is in any way that it is the fruits of my original scholarship. It isn't. But what I would claim is that I think it's necessary to bring scholarship into the domain of grassroots relations. I think that is terribly important, and that is what I try to do. Now, my paper is called The First Century Revisited. It focuses on the first century, Jews, Christians, and the prospect of reconciliation. That is effectively what it is about. And I suppose, given brief time, I tend in these presentations to start at the end, because otherwise we might not arrive. So that you'll know what I'm trying to say, even if it isn't articulated so clearly. And it's always a good idea. If I run out of time at point 6, then that will be immensely frustrating for me and for all concerned, and for my colleague. I suppose what I am looking at is the development of a model for Jewish-Christian relations that is appropriate for our time, that speaks to our condition, and that is rooted in realities, the realities on the ground, which can be extremely difficult, so that we don't bifurcate, if you like. We have exalted discussions on Jews and Christians, and then when we turn to our daily newspaper, we find a world that is, alas, not at all exalted, and that is deeply troubling. One of the features of rooting oneself in the first century is that the first century, too, was a very difficult time. It was a time when many of us were, to say the least, not perfect, when we did not live up to the images that are projected in pure theology. As students of the period will be aware. And today I am aware that when we are speaking of these matters, we are speaking in the context of a very difficult world. The situation in the larger world, the world outside these delightful premises at St. Mary's, is at the present moment deeply troubled, and that somehow one has to have a bridge, I think, between theological discussion and the realities of the Middle East, which are ever with us. The realities of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, which are ever present in Jewish-Christian relations, even if they are not spoken of. Somehow one has to speak to all of that. I wish we could be sort of representative Jewish angels, but that, alas, is not how one is going to be perceived. I have no doubt by many members of the audience, those who are familiar with the world of the West Bank today, with the world of East Jerusalem today, will have reservations about all of our enterprises, unless somehow they can touch base with reality. And that is not easy to do, but it is ever present. The first century perhaps enables us to begin to understand the fragility of religious thought, the fragility of faith. As I once heard, I think, from the late and much-loved Cardinal Hume, that we have precious truths, but they are commended to fragile human hands. And just how fragile we are aware of at the moment in our respective traditions, and I am aware of that in my Jewish tradition. I wish I could tell you how wonderful we all are and how exemplary and our universal mission to the world. But I have to acknowledge that we're not doing too well at it at the moment in many, at least, of our different groups. Diversity indeed that there is, but that there is also much that is troubling. And I think the first century speaks to that condition, because as it is, so it was. But that the aim of, I suppose, my work is to move beyond the model of Jewish-Christian relations and dialogue that I was involved in for about 12 years in my work in the Council of Christians and Jews. I am an academic of relatively recent vintage. I spent a good part of my career at grassroots level, simply talking to Jews and Christians, primarily in this country. That I recall a conversation that I had with a young woman in my own synagogue, who was telling me that in her opinion, and for her generation, this is a young Jewish woman who I've known since she was a child, so she shares her problems with Judaism with me. And she once looked at me and she said, you know, for my generation, Jewish-Christian relations are not really on the map. They are not very important. And I've thought about that. I mean, why not? What did she mean by that? Why did she use the phrase at the beginning, for my generation? Because she was recognizing, I think, that for generations prior, this was not quite so. That Jewish-Christian relations might well have been very important for me, but not so for her. And in a sense, that is a measure of the great achievement of Jewish-Christian relations since over the last 50 years, that she is able to speak in this way, that she recognizes history, but history for her appears to have passed and has changed. There is no longer, in her experience, conflict between Jews and Christians. And there no longer for her seems to be purpose in our engagement, because that engagement was rooted in particular historical circumstances. And while perhaps she is grateful for the work of my generation, it is not something that she considers for herself. That model was effectively governed by the horrors of the 20th century, by a desire to overcome prejudice, misunderstanding, and age-old conflict. And that the progress that has been made since the Ecclesiam Suam is very remarkable. Now, does that mean that we have finished, effectively? That now that we are getting on nicely with each other and there is more understanding, that we can draw to a close and travel on to address the many different conflicts that alas beset us with ever-increasing ferocity? The answer to that is, I suppose, the work that I am doing. It is in answer, to try to give an answer to the young woman with whom I spoke. And that to bring it home and in focus, the first century as an experience, I think, remains shared territory for Jews and Christians. It is a world that enables Jews to understand some, at least, significant elements of Christianity. And it is a world that enables, I think, Christians likewise to understand both Jews and themselves in a very profound way. It gives us a place of conversation, a place of sympathy, and a place, I think, of great enrichment. So that is part one. Part two would be that it is also a place where we can engage with the formative narrative that has shaped Jews and Christians down the ages. That one of the arguments of my paper is that we cannot confine ourselves to dialogue because we are shaped by a narrative, and that unless we address and understand that narrative, then whatever we achieve in our personal relations will not suffice, even if our achievement is by no means negligible, because it will be swept away every year when the narrative is reenacted at the heart of the liturgy. One has to address, and we need all of the assistance that we can get from scholarship over here. We are part of a shared narrative, and conversation alone will not suffice. And I speak of the exploration of that narrative. I borrowed a phrase, I think, from Paul Ricoeur, a hermeneutic of restoration. That in our addressing of that narrative, we are not trying to subvert it. We are trying to restore it. By restoration, to restore the fullness of its context, to make our way past the prejudicial readings of millennia, and to restore it as it was, so that we will be able to see it again, rather like restoring paintings in art galleries. You see a painting that is covered with the grime, if you like, of goodness knows how long, and then the restorers set to work, and the results are truly wonderful. You see the picture as it was painted originally. That is how I would envisage scholarship in these fields. That scholarship is not something that is undermining either Christian or Jewish belief. Scholarship is not trying to subvert anyone, or scholarship is an act of restoration, an act of reparation, so that the narrative can be as it was in the beginning, at least in some measure. One has to be very careful with this, obviously, and to set about it with considerable humility, but that nevertheless, this seems to me to be a task, and it is one that I think is very revealing. So stage one would be a ground of communality, a place where in particular Jews can understand and empathize with significant formative elements of the church, even if obviously they will not perhaps be likewise empathic with the theological experience, but that nevertheless the world of the church, the world that gives rise to that theological description, they can begin to engage with. Secondly, the restoration. In the process of restoration, there comes understanding. Many of the problems, I think, of Jewish-Christian relations are because the context of the narrative was lost. Even by the earliest readers, you can find this in the 2nd century, let alone in later centuries, that the narrative of Galilee and Judea is taken out into a world that knows not Galilee and Judea, and as a result of which it is misconstrued or misunderstood, especially in the dynamics of the Jews of that age and their engagements. So that would be The first is a ground of sympathy, the second is a hermeneutic of restoration. But the third goes beyond that, because it gives us a sense of renewed purpose. That if people are to engage in these matters, one needs, having achieved all of these things, what have they got to say to the world? What would I have to say to the young woman I was speaking to in the synagogue? And I think the answer to that is a great deal, because it is the first century that has spoken to major theologians, Christian theologians, who have sought to relate their own Christian understanding to the world in which they live. And I refer in particular to two figures. One is Jürgen Moltmann, in his writings on Messiah, which are very fascinating from a perspective of Jewish-Christian dialogue, although I know Jews have reservations, to say the least, about his theodicy, but nevertheless, his Christology, if you like, is very remarkable, because it is a Christology of dialogue in the first instance. That has taken us a long way from the replacement theology that Dr. McDade referred us to. As you see a theology of dialogue in his work. He is forming his understanding of Messiah in dialogue with the Judaic understanding of Messiah. And he's doing that not as an act of piety, or simply to be nice and accommodating to Jews. He's doing it because it seems to be supremely relevant to his experience. The second figure that I would refer to, and one about whom I have few, if any, reservations. I find I resonate very strongly with much of what he has to say. And that is the Catholic figure of Johann Baptist Metz. If you want to refound Christian-Jewish relations, you need look no further than the work of Johann Baptist Metz. There you get a full and profound engagement with Judaic tradition. But again, they are drawing upon it, not as an act of community relations, but because it is supremely meaningful for them. So that would be, if you like, stage 3. The world of Metz and of Moltmann. Now, where are they coming from? They are both, of course, coming from the single experience of living in Germany in the second half of the 20th century and trying to come to terms with all that had happened and the horrors that had happened. The new generations in Germany, the task of simply being themselves is extraordinary and utterly difficult when they look back at the events that happened in the lives of their parents and their grandparents. And when they look at the world through the experience of the Second World War, and of course, and particularly in the work of Metz. Metz, as he puts it, writes in the presence of Auschwitz. He writes in the presence of the Holocaust. And he develops, in fact, a different mode of Christology, which is a Christology, as with Moltmann, that is no longer triumphalist in any sense. It is a Christology focused in the suffering of the world. Again, I wish I had time to elaborate on all of these matters, but I simply recommend that you read both of them, because this seems to me, this Christology of suffering, the particular analysis of messianism that they give, a Christian messianism in dialogue constantly with Jewish messianism, the Jewish sense of the unredeemed nature of the world is newly present in the writings of these Christian theologians. The notion of a Christologia viae, a Christology that is on its way rather than achieved, if you like, which is associated with them, is something that I think is crucially important for our time, and brings both Jews and Christians, this particular focus, this particular form of messianism, seems to me to be enormously important. In an age when, and one is particularly aware of this in Britain, the idealism, the visions of politics have disappeared from the public realm. We are a market-driven society, a neoliberal society only. And there are very few voices of challenge to that. And it seems to me that the world recovered from the first century is one of the few places where you can find challenge to all that is happening in our time. And that the messianism is not only, I think, important to be heard in the wider world, it is important today to be heard in the Jewish world. Today we have two forms of messianism. The core of the settlers on the West Bank are inspired by a form of messianism. By no means all of them, but certainly the most formidable. And that form of messianism is challenged. It's challenged in both of our traditions. And it is important for that to be said. So on the one hand, we are challenging certain things within the Jewish world, but on the other, we are speaking universally to the wider world. It is remarkable that I think that the only powerful voice of challenge to the current situation, at least in the West, that we have, seems to me to be the voice of the Catholic Church and the voice of Pope Francis. He, in all that he does, is trying to give people a different set of insights. I don't mean by that at all that he is the only person or that only Catholics, but the only sort of presence, the public presence. And this, I'm afraid, gives Catholic friends an enormous responsibility because the idealism of politics has disappeared. It is as simple as that. We are all managerial. We are all market-driven. When I was growing up, each of the political parties in our country had a set of ideas. And you chose, when you voted, which particular vision you would wish to buy into. Many of them, incidentally, were rooted in Christian tradition and ultimately in the Bible that we share. Today, that is no longer the case. It is as simple as that. And this means that the role of those of us who have inherited the biblical tradition, far from being irrelevant, is in fact absolutely crucial. It is an enormous responsibility. I learned, talking with religious leaders when I was at CCJ, how difficult it is to speak out politically. But I think that the line taken recently, which does not speak politics, but speaks about poverty, and simply articulates the condition of those who are suffering, is immensely important. It is in fact absolutely crucial because no one else is. The political circles from whom this would be expected are no longer delivering in the same way. So this is the world in which we find ourselves. And this too, of course, was the world of the first century. That I realise I've reached the end of my time, so it was a good job I started at the end, because otherwise I would never have gotten to it. But that the world of the first century was precisely a world where business triumphed, agribusiness, if you like, the world of the Roman Empire, the world overshadowed by Herod the Great and his political and international ambitions, a world which was preoccupied by money. The money changers in the temple, the story is a very simple story, although I must say I've come across the most convoluted explanations of what was really happening. I think for people in the first century it was immensely simple. You would have spoken to them instantly, because they were a society, especially those who came from Galilee, unused to money. And to find money pervading even their most sacred place would have been deeply shocking. One needs little more than that. It was a world where the new Roman Empire was claiming hegemony theologically as well as politically, the Augustan propaganda, which the first Christians did not hesitate to subvert. Many well-known Christian words, in fact, are drawn from imperial propaganda. It is a highly subversive thing to do. There was a Prince of Peace, but it was not Augustus, etc. There was good news, Evangelium, but again, it was not Augustus. And to say this it would have been, to say the least, I think, very challenging. So there are points in common. There are also other points in common, and this I would draw to a close with. Corruption, occupation, they are all words of the first century. And what happens as a result is not pleasant. We do not behave perfectly. There are religious phenomena that are deeply regrettable in the Jewish world, without a shadow of a doubt. So this is not a world when we can speak hagiographically of ourselves. But that fundamentally this is, I think, the relevance of Jewish-Christian relations today, but in the mode that I think it was proposed above all by Johann Baptist Metz, and which I personally would strongly underline. It is a Christian-Jewish relations, if you like, for our time, for the generation of the young person who was sharing her thoughts with me in the synagogue. It speaks very strongly to the world of our time. It is a hermeneutic of restoration. If you hear the Beatitudes through this, you will hear them differently. It is as simple as that, and we will all hear them differently. And it is a place where we can actually give substance to, I think, the vision that was being articulated by Dr. McDade in his keynote lecture of today. So that, broadly speaking, is what I would like to say. The details will have to wait, and you can sit on the edges of your seats until the paper sees the light of day. But it is a long way from Ecclesiam Suam, I think. But without Ecclesiam Suam, it would never have happened. Thank you very much.
So this morning we had John McDade drawing from Rosenzweig, and now we have a Jewish thinker drawing from Metz and Moltmann. And I think that does indicate that there's a huge travelling distance that has happened since the Ecclesiam Suam. I'm very delighted to introduce to you our second speaker, Professor Mary Boys, who has come over from Union Theological Seminary in New York, where she is the Skinner and McAlpin Professor of Practical Theology. And Mary's new book, Redeeming Our Sacred Story, The Death of Jesus and Relations Between Jews and Christians, I can honestly commend, because I've read it from page to page, because I've just finished reviewing it. And I did nearly fall off my bike because I was so gripped at reading it that I was going to be late for a lecture. So I had to rush from my home, and I didn't fall off my bike, but it did make me think. And in the same way that Jonathan's talk, what I think is remarkable about this book is that it weaves together incredible scholarship related to the New Testament, but connecting it up with its transmission in the liturgy and the way in which so much is transmitted through liturgical forms that still remain deeply problematic well after Nostra Aetate. In fact, it sort of, for me, was a big wake-up call to recognise how little had happened, despite how much had happened in other areas. And I think I just want to mention one other thing about Mary, and it's really sort of maps onto the type of Jonathan's story. Here, working in a Catholic institution, Mary has been celebrated with honorary degrees from the Hebrew College Jewish Institute of Religion, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and received in 2005 the Sternberg Award from the International Council of Christians and Jews. So we have another person who has carried out a faithful, long, devoted pilgrimage in Jewish-Christian relations. Do welcome, please, Mary Boyce.
Thank you very much, Gavin. I want to thank the conference organizers, Peter Tyler and Stephen Bullivant, for the invitation to cross the pond and to participate in this very stimulating conference, and also to thank Steph Modak, who is the administrator of the Center for the Initiatives in Spirituality and Reconciliation, of which Peter is the director. And it's been a pleasure to have some interaction with Jonathan Gorsky. We had not met until Monday. And I thought it might be helpful. I have to stand on my tiptoes because I really hate being hidden behind a podium, which are really only meant for tall men. And I'm only a boy, so this is how we proceeded. I did not know with whom I was supposed to dialogue until mid-May. And when I got Jonathan's name, I emailed him and said, "What shall we dialogue about?" And you recognize that for those of us who teach, mid-May is not the ideal moment to drop everything and to write a paper. So in early June, he sent me 13 sort of paragraphs that would be like what I would call the conceptual scaffolding of a paper, and I proceeded from there. So I'm really commenting from my own perspective on what he set up, except the paragraph that I worked the most with he didn't really use. Very mischievous, I must say, but that's all right, I can read it. So in the first instance then today, I want to respond to be a true dialogue partner with Jonathan. But secondly, I would call my paper an attempt to develop aspects of a spirituality that reconciles, based on biblical texts that have provided, I hate to say this, but raw materials for hostility to Jews. And I remind you that we begin not only with Ecclesiam Suam, but with the text that comes the next year as well from the Council, Nostra Aetate, and in particular today, section 4, and that quotation that's so often used maybe in a parish bulletin, but I think must be a curiosity to many people. That is, what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction, then alive nor against the Jews of today. True, the Jewish authorities and those who followed their lead pressed for the death of Jesus. So it's, first of all, it's a pretty ambiguous statement, typical kind of political compromise that is necessary in all such documents. But it is an odd thing, especially if this is in the parish bulletin on Good Friday, when we then proceed to read the Passion according to John, in which it's very clear who kills Jesus. So let me then begin with a paragraph that is the 10th of your 13 points. I read from Dr. Gorsky. I will not say the word of the Lord at the end, but...
Please don't.
Christian-Jewish relations are shaped primarily by Christian readings of a sacred narrative and its liturgical and cultural articulation. Within what has been the dominant reading of this narrative, Jews and Judaism are defined and configured in a manner that has created an indelible imagery that had so many tragic consequences down the generations. This means that the lingua franca of contemporary interfaith relations, that is, the various forms of dialogue so clearly enunciated in Vatican documents over recent decades, will not suffice, as whatever is achieved, even if it is by no means negligible, will be swept away every year when the narrative is reenacted at the heart of the liturgical year. I must say that's remarkably diplomatic. I apologize, I'm a blunt American, and I hope that you'll be able to bear the harsh cadences of my American-inflected speech. I'd hoped to get a posh British accent for this occasion, but I'm unable, or as apparently we say in New York, go figure. So I would consider what I'm doing today in the first instance a kind of a midrash on your argument. So let me say it a little bit my way. Official church documents from Nostra Aetate to the present have indeed made an important and crucial contributions to reconciliation with Jews. These statements, however, cannot overcome the negative effect of the Passion narratives and of other troubling texts when they are proclaimed without a commentary that explains key contextual elements. In my paper, I have some examples from the various liturgical celebrations, not only of Lent in general, Holy Week in particular, but also the readings from the Acts of the Apostles that are part of the Sundays in the Easter season. I think that in this audience, I can presume that you know most of those. It's very clear in all of those readings that the responsibility for the death of Jesus lies on the Jewish people, either as a whole or as subgroups, the chief priests and elders of the people. And I also would remind us that even those with the most minimal of Christian educations, which seems to be almost everybody today, pardon my depression and cynicism, that the fundamental plot line is very well known. Even people largely unschooled in the Christian tradition who have a sort of a glancing familiarity with the New Testament know that these texts have to do with the death of Jesus and somehow the evil people who set upon him. And of course the Gospels are so memorable, and of course it's always the villainous characters who are the most memorable. Judas, Caiaphas, the chief priests and elders of the people, and then in the fourth Gospel, the Jews. And I would remind us also that this is not simply something that we get from our liturgies, that scenes from the Passion narratives have dominated Christian art. They're enacted in passion plays and films. They're a staple of sacred music. So you need never have to have picked up the New Testament to know at least the fundamental contours. Now, while the plot is basically well known, relatively few Christians, even in the more prosperous West, are cognizant of the consequences for Jews. In part, I think this stems from the demographic reality that most Christians in the world do not encounter Jews in their daily lives. As a result, the church's relationship with Judaism seems tangential to the practice of Christianity and indeed how we understand the world itself. Now, in some respects, I think this is understandable, particularly in communities overwhelmed by poverty and violence. Their degree of dislocation is already so severe that further immersion in the shadow side of the tradition could be paralyzing. Yet it is also likely that Christians in such communities, typically lacking the resources and opportunities for knowledge of this history, will therefore continue in the inadequate view of Judaism that has so long been troubling our tradition. But whether or not Christians encounter Jews in our daily lives, we are nonetheless obliged to honor the commandment, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." To put it bluntly, Christians have used texts to bear false witness against Jews, albeit often because Christians have assumed that the texts themselves were factual accounts. But in this grace moment, we have both the resources to read ancient texts in a new way and the ethical obligation to do so. It's not a matter of rewriting, but of rereading and reinterpreting, perhaps the hermeneutics of restoration. So the challenge lies on us Christians. What do we do with texts that are harmful to another religious tradition, yet vital to ours? To put it another way, how do we unleash the power in the story of the passion and death of Jesus, while acknowledging that this story has also served as raw material for harsh depiction of Jews as enemies of Christ and thus of Christianity? How do we teach sacred texts that have been used sacrilegiously? How do we expose the shadow side without blocking the light? And perhaps this is only a problem in the United States. I hope it is. How do we bring these questions to the fore in a church that has grown largely complacent about the study of Scripture? One last question. In what ways might the passion narratives be interpreted so as to animate a spirituality that reconciles? So I'm going to suggest 4 ways. My emphasis is on the resources for rereading ancient texts, but let me just tell you what underlies this. I think the thing that has most affected what I have done has been a determination to take history seriously. Not simply to acknowledge it's been a tragic history, but to look it in the face. And I'm speaking not only about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, but at the very long history, starting in the 1st century and going up through the end of the Second World War. And I think in many ways I resonate particularly with this. It's become almost an aphorism from Johannes Baptist Metz, and that is that if you are doing theology in the same way after Auschwitz, ask yourself what your theology is. I am convinced that is the one criterion that we must take with absolute seriousness. But in this short time that I have, I'm not going to do the sort of the historical, but rather in an attempt to be more pastoral, I'd like to make some suggestions about how we might interpret and indeed teach and preach about the passion narratives in our time. So this is really aimed particularly at the Christian and Catholic members here. So I have 4 suggestions. First, we must be more attentive to our vocabulary so that it mirrors the complexity of the situations from which it arose. The complexity of the 1st century seems largely hidden when I hear a homily. I don't need purgatory. I've heard many a homily. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. I am struck, among other things, by how casually homilists speak of Jesus' followers as Christians, as if with the death and resurrection, the ways between Judaism and Christianity had parted as the waters of the Red Sea. It is so important to recognize that Jews and Christians are complex and capacious terms. Jewish and Christian identities were fluid in the early centuries, not just the 1st century. And Jew encompassed a very complicated people in starkly different economic, social, political, and geographic realities. In speaking about New Testament texts, instead of just implying there were the Christians and the Jews over which Jesus stands, we might speak particularly of Jesus-believing Jews and Torah-believing Jews. Or sometimes non-Jesus-believing Jews, but that's sort of like being a non-Catholic, or women as non-men, and it doesn't really give much of a positive identity. I'm not sure that those are always the best terms, but this sense that there were Jews who had different viewpoints, but they were all seeking God. They're all seeking. I think in the Matthean account of Jesus, Matthew presents Jesus as something like the new Torah. And you can see how there's an argument in the community about what is the true Torah. Is it the way of Moses, so to speak, or is it the way of Jesus? These were genuine dilemmas that were part of the communities and were not resolved readily. So instead of implying rigid boundaries, it's far more accurate and pastorally responsible to present Christians and Jews in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era more, this is from Boyarin, more as dialects of a single language, something like Spanish speakers in Mexico and Puerto Rico or in Cuba, than as separate languages, and with many gradations. As the 2nd century developed, Jesus-believing Gentiles came to outnumber Jesus-believing Jews. Christians gradually became separate from Jews as a religious entity, but only over a lengthy period of time. There was no single turning point No single point of separation. The dialects eventually grew into separate languages, but at different times, under different circumstances, and in a different location. Even by the 4th century, when the separation seemed in most places to have taken place, what it meant to religious authorities may not have been the same thing that it meant to the average people, whoever the average people are. I think of an example of this, and I just very briefly, of John Chrysostom's homilies against the Judaizers. And he's railing against people. Why? Because they're not only going to his tiny little church, but they're also attending the very prominent synagogue in Antioch, and they're going to both festivals. And as a religious authority, this flexibility and boundary is very worrisome. But obviously the people thought somehow that these were both possible. And so we're not, this is 4th century. So it's important to recognize that this separation, this parting of the ways, happened over a longer period of time than we are generally given the impression. But once the separation hardened, it affected how the New Testament was understood and how it still is understood. Because as Gentiles increasingly constituted the Ecclesia, the Jewish matrix of Jesus' life and ministry was obscured, and so what the Gospels attribute him saying to other Jews now becomes something against Jews. So I think that's a very important, if in our teaching and our preaching we really thought about the complexity of the background of all New Testament texts, it would be immensely helpful. Second point. I'm the last thing standing before lunch, so I'm trying to move this along here. Second, theological reflection on the death of Jesus must take account of the historical context of crucifixion in the Roman Empire. And you, in a sense, alluded to this, Jonathan, and I want to do a little more detail here. Jesus was crucified by the authority of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, likely in collaboration with the Jewish high priesthood. Together, they formed what Gerard Sloyan has called the power class, although power was not equal because the Roman governor entirely controlled the high priests. And although the precise charge against Jesus cannot be established with absolute confidence, it's likely that Pilate viewed Jesus as guilty of sedition for having preached about the counter-kingdom, that is, the reign of God. And then when you realize the chutzpah of the early followers of Jesus in attributing to Jesus the same titles that were given to the Caesar. So the Caesar was the divine Son of God and God from God, Lord, Redeemer, Liberator, and Savior of the world. And in applying that to the crucified one, a very, very bold move had been made. So indeed, there was a threat to the Roman Empire, but not a military threat. Now, we who are Catholics have for so long viewed crucifixes on the walls of our homes and churches that we see only Jesus of Nazareth as the crucified one. I'm not critical of this. It's certainly, as a lifelong Catholic, this is very understandable. But I think that we can enlarge our worldview if we realize that in the Roman Empire, crucifixion was a widespread mode of torture and murder. It was imposed upon thousands of Jews and other groups over whom the empire ruled. Crucifixion, moreover, had a chilling effect. It was highly organized, massive state terrorism, intended to intimidate the vast peasant and slave populations of the Roman Empire into passivity. It was a spectacle for the edification of those watching. If I might provide a contemporary example, a day after the death of the Libyan leader, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, in October of 2011, the New York Times published a lengthy analysis of his regime, including a graphic description of the violence he fomented in order to control the Libyan people. And here I quote, "In the late 1970s and early 80s, he, Gaddafi, eliminated even mild critics through public trials and executions. Kangaroo courts were staged on soccer fields or basketball courts, where the accused were interrogated, often urinating in fear as they begged for their lives. The events were televised to make sure that no Libyan missed the point. The bodies of one group of students hanged in downtown Tripoli's main square and were left there to rot for a week. And traffic was rerouted in order to force cars to pass by. And so by hanging people in the public square and leaving them there to rot, you knew that you dared to oppose Gaddafi at the risk of your own life. I think that's what crucifixion functioned to do and to say in the Roman Empire. And I think that gives us a very powerful way of understanding what happened to Jesus of Nazareth, even if we can't be sure of exactly what the charges were. Third, situating the death of Jesus in its historical context provides a teachable moment for countering what Dr. Gorsky has termed the dominant reading of the Gospels and the Passion narratives, that is, the attribution of responsibility of the crucifixion to Jews. Jesus stands not in primary opposition to Judaism, but to the empire over which Caesar rules as Lord and Savior. Responsibility for his death falls not to the Jews, but to the Roman governor in alliance with the power class. Jesus, the Jew from Nazareth, suffers the excruciating death by crucifixion, not as the lone victim of Jewish hostility to the Son of God, but as one of thousands of Jews and others whom the empire tortured as a deterrent. Now, another historical dimension arises here, one more difficult, far more difficult to teach and preach, yet critical. That is, acknowledging that Christian interpretations of the death of Jesus that blame Jews have done grave harm to Jews and to the church's moral integrity. It is mortifying to discover the depth and breadth of violence against Jews by Christians, a violence that's been, in the first instance, rhetorical, but then physical. It has shadowed our preaching and teaching. We have, I think, an ethical obligation to face this history, because the bitter offerings we Christians have brought to the banquet of biblical interpretation haunt us, requiring us to fast from triumphalism. I was fascinated by the phrase that Canon Zagofsky used on Monday, 3 months ago, whenever Monday was, an ecumenism of kenosis. I do think kenosis is applicable here to Christians in regard to our reading of the Passion narratives. And part of this, it seems to me, is really the importance of breaking through the sort of the lazy fundamentalism that's just part of our cultures in many respects. So few people really know, have been exposed to any way of reading biblical texts other than assuming they're factual. So the importance, I think, in preaching of being clear about the nature of the Bible as the Word of God in human language, a text that mediates divine revelation but is not to be equated with it. And reading biblical texts in a discerning manner and showing how they bear the limitations and wounds of human finitude. But more than that, we must pursue the consequences of our interpretation of texts. In the realm of biblical scholarship, this has given rise to the method of sort of the history of effects. In Dorothée Zolle's terms, the hermeneutic of consequences, not a preachable phrase for sure, but attentiveness to the consequences of how the Bible has been used by real people in concrete circumstances as grounding the church in space and time. Searching for the fruits of the text. How has this text made a difference, for good or for ill, in the life of real people? And it seems to me that when we encounter the misuse of these texts, the sacrilegious use of these texts, then one of the necessary consequences for us is the ability to grieve. And maybe for me that's a more important term than kenosis, the self-emptying. That is, take responsibility for the consequences of how we have used biblical texts. And this involves more than intellectual knowledge, although it certainly does require careful thought. But I think one of the calls for us today as Christians specifically in this context as Catholics, is to be affected by the wounds of history that Christianity has afflicted, and to be responsive to disturbing truths about one's own tradition. And this is really a very difficult and delicate matter, particularly with young people who see no purpose to Christianity in the first place. But I think, nonetheless, it's necessary. And I think if the church could show a genuine wrestling with its own, with the wounds that it has afflicted, it could make a real difference in the world. Fourth and finally, it's vital to connect the death of Jesus to his ministry. And I think this is one of the things that I miss the most in the preaching about the death of Jesus. In the parish to which I belong, we almost always anyway, sing the creeds. And more we're singing them in Latin, and more things in Latin, because then we don't have to use the new translation that is not exactly poetry to my ears. So it's a sort of a wonderful irony, you know. But whenever we come to he was made incarnate by the Virgin Mary, we just get Jesus coming in the flesh, and then crucified by Pontius Pilate. And I just want to take the creed and push it apart. The impression that Jesus became incarnate principally in order to be crucified for us is, I think, an unintended consequence of the creeds. Now, the most simplistic and crudest interpretation of this is the following. For Jesus, dying was his reason for living. He died for you so that you might live forgiven. If there were another way to God, Jesus' death would have been unnecessary. Our problem is our sin that separates us from God, and Jesus' death is our only cure. This came from one of the commentaries around the Mel Gibson film, The Passion of the Christ. But I think it totally turns the gospel on its head. That Jesus came to die, and not to invite us to participate in God's reign. So, in the educational realm, we speak of the so-called null curriculum. I don't know if that term has any kind of usage over here. But I think it's a very interesting term, and it's something that those of us who work in schools need to think about. This comes from actually an art educator by the name of Elliot Eisner. And what he means by it is we teach. When we look at what we leave out, we have to ask, what are we teaching by not teaching it? Now, you can't teach everything, so you have to be selective. But I think in many respects, the link between the ministry of Jesus and his crucifixion is the church's null curriculum. We just don't speak enough about it. Jesus died as a consequence of what he lived for and how he embodied God's merciful justice. He was a victim of imperial Rome. He was a threat to the cult of the emperor and to the theology of empire. Now, there are important theological ramifications of this connection between the ministry and the mode of his death. That Jesus was crucified is important because it reminds us that he, through whom we Christians see God revealed, is one with the marginal peoples of this world, all of those whom brutal rulers, whether Pontius Pilate or Hitler or Pol Pot, or we could add on to all too many, considered expendable, of non-human status. The following of Christ obligates us to respond to the suffering of people in our time. And contemplating Jesus' prophetic witness enables us to make connections to our own broken world. So here I think we're speaking somewhat different languages, but the same point. A world in which people at the margins suffer so greatly. And we know people in our own day who, despite opposition and danger, nevertheless carry on their advocacy for a more just society, even if they suffer death for it. And this is the great power, I think, of the story of the Passion for us. Their memory inspires and sustains us because, like Jesus, they were willing to carry on for a cause greater than themselves, a cause furthering God's reign on earth. In their passionate commitment to counter evil in its varied and powerful manifestations, they mediate the divine care for creation. These saints exemplify God's desire for the flourishing of all, human and non-human. In our time, Nostra Aetate, we have the resources to read ancient texts in new ways and the ethical obligation to do so. I end with the question: how might we energize our church to take up these tasks?
I wonder if we could have a microphone for the answers, question and answer session. Sorry, I don't want to break it. Thanks. Okay, thank you both very much. I think, given that we've only got 15 minutes, I'm going to go straight away to ask each speaker to have about a minute of comment or question, and then to open up as soon as possible. But there's a lot that you've both given to us. Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to...
Firstly, I'm very grateful for Professor Mary Boy's talk, her lecture, and its clarity. And it seems to underline my concern with history. I think that history and of understanding of history of the first century is crucial and goes beyond dialogue. I think that scholarship is vital, but there's also the question of how we transmit scholarship to the wider world. And I'm never sure when I hear and talk about liturgy, especially the liturgy of different communities. I know in my own Orthodox Jewish tradition how difficult it would be to change a liturgy. Even a small nuance, and you will get frisson in the community. But the contents of liturgy and how precisely one handles them. I was having a conversation with our head of theology at Heathrop about this, and he was telling me about, I think it's the Good Friday liturgy, when you firstly hear Jews welcoming Jesus into Jerusalem, and then apparently the same Jews participants in the crucifixion. Now this must be, I haven't experienced it, so can only talk of it. It must be a very powerful moment. For me, my instant response was that, well, they were different people. There might well have been people, I'm sure there were people who welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, and there were indeed people who said what they said, particularly in Matthew at the crucifixion, but it does not follow they were the same people. However, liturgically it does. And what and how we can address this. I would say that Jews are not innocent liturgically. There are passages in our liturgy which are today freely applied to all manner of people who believe in God, that were initially intended for people who were pagan or idolatrous or whatever. And that among some of our brethren there is even a desire to restore even more vitriolic versions than we have actually in the prayer book. So the problem of liturgy is in fact very great. It's not one that we have really spoken of too much, I think, in Christian Jewish dialogue. Perhaps because we don't really know how to speak of it. The liturgy is fixed, but what are we to do? And how are we to surmount? Very briefly, one other problem that I have with this is goes right back to biblical liturgy and our psalms, Tehillim, as Jews call them, the psalms of violence and the psalms of vengeance. I often think again of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of young people growing up in synagogues and whatever, in a time of life-threatening conflict, and what on earth are these liturgies going to do to them? So I think that liturgy seems to be something that we really need to think about, but I don't know, in terms of a hermeneutic of consequences, it's very difficult to see how we're going to be consequential.
Of course, Vatican II already changed our liturgy. Now, that led to many attention, but I think for us, those of us in lectionary churches, I think the problem is more what text should actually be in the lectionary. I had a conversation with Lynn briefly after Mass last night that even though I love the stories in 1 Kings, they really aren't quite fit for public proclamation. I mean, unless you're going to really preach on them, and that would be a challenge in and of itself. So I think that it's really important that we take a look at our lectionary, but more than that, that we really, my sense is, and I probably should, I was kind of a hyperbole about purgatory and homilies, but what I'm finding is that among priests of more recent vintage, they have no ability to speak to the scriptures. It's not wrong, it's just vacuous. And these are such important teachable moments. And and I think sometimes when the texts have a little problem in them, they're terrified to touch the problem. But the problem is you've proclaimed the text, and then we've said this is the word of the Lord, and what are people to think unless there's some commentary? And I look around my parish and I think, my, there are many people here who could preach about this text. Why are you avoiding it? Maybe that's why. But anyway, let's open this before I get out.
Okay. Ivana.
Thank you very much, Mary and Jonathan, for your fascinating contributions. I was really struck by both of you addressing the question of the restorative hermeneutics, the restoration of the narrative. And I was wondering whether really it is enough to look back at how the text was at the beginning, or how the narrative was at the beginning. And I was thinking of George Florovsky, an Orthodox theologian, who spoke quite a lot about tradition, and he was one of the people who was a strong speaker for the rediscovering of the roots, but who would say also that we need to go forward to the roots. And I was wondering whether it is not also how the narrative will be at the end, to what kind of narrative we are traveling to. Because if we look, for example, at the Passion narratives, what kind of beginning can we get beyond the holy texts that we have? And in the holy text that we have, there is already so many problems which we need to address and to grow through them and with them. We cannot sort of edit the Gospels and, like Marcion did, and sort of cut things out of there, but we need to grow with them. So what would be both of your reactions, perhaps also to the eschatological restoration of our texts?
Very good.
I myself, that's not quite the right term for me. I think the connection, I'm not sure what the right term is that it's not only what text meant in their originating context, but what texts have inspired and sustained and justified over time that should be. Because what do we want people to do with these texts? When we proclaim the Passion narratives, how do we want people changed or affected? So restoration, I started when I read Jonathan's paper, I started to think, well, maybe we have an analogy here with art restoration. And then I started to do some reading on that, and I found that it's very controversial today to what extent you should do restoration. So I said, I think I'll just let that one go. So, but I really think it's important. And this is why I'm very struck by the mission statement about a spirituality that reconciles. What if those of us who teach and preach said, what in this text has elements of a spirituality that reconciles? Not just between Christians and Jews, but more generally. Maybe that would be of some help.
Yes, thank you for raising this problem. I think the reason for my approach was that, quite simply, I know the sacrality, the sacredness, if you like, of the texts for the different communities. And the question is how we work within that. I know, I recall having a conversation about this with an Orthodox priest, an Orthodox Christian priest with whom I was very friendly. And he told me that if I ever considered joining the Orthodox Church, I should not do so with a view to changing anything, because it wasn't going to happen. And that was where I started off from my notion of a hermeneutic of restoration. I know how threatening some communities find, from my own experience, the historical analysis of text, because the sacred text completely disintegrates before your eyes, and that would simply be rightly, I think, rejected out of hand. I suppose one example that the example that I gave of Psalms, of the Psalms of violence and vengeance. If you want to read a very good approach to this, it's a Christian approach. There is a German scholar called Erich Zenger, who has written, Z-E-N-G-E-R, a book called Psalms of Violence and Vengeance, which is a very remarkable book, where one uses the same psalms, I think, but one prays them differently. One is aware of the emotion that led to these psalms. One is aware that what people went through that led to these expressions of violence. And instead of replicating in one's own heart precisely those feelings, one brings these feelings in prayer to God. So if one is likewise perhaps aware of where the passion narratives came from, that for me they can be seen almost as a liturgy of trauma. That those who experienced the crucifixion historically, one cannot, I think, even begin to describe the horror of those moments and how they described and how they witnessed it. And that the Christian narratives are ultimately how they were trying to cope with that and what it meant for them. Now, there is one point of view that I was trying to propound with the students, and which turned out to be somewhat controversial. And that is that it did not surprise me, perhaps, that the people at the very beginning would have focused on the high priest, on the role of the high priest, because that would have been for them so deeply shocking. It was that the high priest, whatever he might have been by the time we get to this period, was still somebody who was the great atoning figure, if you like, on the Day of Atonement, the heart of the faith. And that he was in any way anywhere near complicity with Rome would for them have been perhaps their point of preoccupation. Now, if one understands them, and one also understands what the high priesthood had become, by the time we get to Joseph Caiaphas, I mean, absolutely forget about the beautiful description in Ben Sirah of the high priest. That was not Joseph Caiaphas. To survive for 16 or 17 years as high priest was a unique achievement and does not bespeak spiritual greatness on the part of the office holder. But this is what I mean by a restoration of text. It's perhaps seeing beyond, if you like, what they actually meant, as to why they actually meant that, and working with what they meant. I don't simply mean my art restoration. I take the point that it wasn't necessarily the best illustration of what I was saying, because having restored, one then has to work with what one has, if you like, restored, and to learn to see it in that way. By restoration, I didn't quite mean what perhaps I sort of said. I meant something slightly different.
David.
Just quickly, thank you very, very much. Really loved it. Just two short stories to illustrate how people receive a hermeneutic of restoration in different ways. 30 years ago, I was giving a paper at a conference of activists, Christian activists, and I was doing something on the Gospels, and it was text from the Gospels to challenge them. And someone got up at the end and said, well, what was it like to be a craft worker in first century Palestine? I'd already done 12 years of scripture scholarship, and I couldn't answer. I didn't know. So I went away, and for the next 2 years, I researched it. And at the time, it was hard because there weren't the books. So what I ended up doing was going to Middle Eastern archaeology, to classical studies, and so on, and then gradually put a sort of picture together. Went back 2 years later, gave a paper precisely on this to 200 Christian worker activists. Then one chap leapt up at the end and said, "Why has no one ever told us this?" And we had a fantastic discussion about, in their terms, discipleship. They would want to follow such a man who was willing to do these things in that sort of context. The year before last, I was invited to a very famous carmel in this country, I won't say which one, so Contemplative Sisters, very famous, full of hugely intelligent women. Well, full, there's only about 30 in the community, but... And I went, and I was brought into the community, into clausura, and they wanted me to do this with them as well. Take the parables, but put them into this sort of political, social, economic context, you see. So I did this, you see, and they engaged very seriously with my, with the stuff. But I could see that one of them, my hero, in fact, the person who's written books on prayer, which have transformed my own spiritual life over the years, was not at all happy. See, she's this 80-year-old, but very sharp woman, and asked various questions. But anyway, when I left and went back to Birmingham, she wrote to me, "Dear David, the community enjoyed your exposition of the parables, but we have some reservations about your depiction of Jesus." And then what she basically then went into, she said, "We know you're in love with Jesus." I thought, "But we do not see how you can get from what you are saying about him as a man of the first century to the Christ of faith." Now, I'd spent 20 years of my life in seminary trying to make sure students could do that. And I was absolutely shattered that this group of such extremely gifted women thought that's somehow what I'd done. But there's two totally different readings of a hermeneutic of restoration. And I don't want to answer it or anything. It's just that I've been thinking about that ever since, because it sort of shocked me, really. And because I'm still doing this with the worker groups, and that's fine. But here was a whole other, where I'd sort of offended their spirituality.
Okay, so a very quick closing comment from both our speakers.
Be very quick. John Dominic Crossan, whose work I don't fully agree with in more recent years, but he had a wonderful comment about Jesus telling the parables. That he said, I imagine people listening to his parables and, caught up in the story, and they say at the end, "I don't think I got the point. And if I did, I don't think I like it."
Yeah.
That's just one thing. Second, I want to take what we've done this morning back to Monday night with the film of Gods and Men. Because one of the things about the monks of Tiberine is that I think they had a very real sense of Jesus, of the Passion, but their martyrdom, they didn't die because martyrdom is a good and holy thing in itself. That's one of the most profound things of the film. They died because of the people for whom they existed. And I think that similar things are said about, to me, this is why Jesus dies, because of the circumstances of his life. And anyway, I just think that's a very, very powerful, powerful film. And I think the book on the monks of Tiberine is also really edifying reading.
So, well, there is so much that one can say, especially about your comments. The notion of history and faith, very complex and difficult. History used in sort of post-Enlightenment scholarship as an instrument of the subversion of tradition. It is not what it claims to be, and so forth. Therefore, people draw back from history, which I think is a great loss. I think if a historical exposition does challenge faith, then there should be a dialogue. Because otherwise one's faith can be, I think, enriched by the dialogue, And that for me, as I said, I draw upon history also for what it can teach us today. When one looks at the first century, there are many aspects that mutatis mutandis can be translated in a straightforward way into our world, and we are responsible for that because it is our joint charge and our mutual heritage. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I'm afraid because of lunch I will have to stop, but I just want to say thank you so much. On Monday we began sort of looking at the pre-story of Ecclesiam, and today we have arrived at now, and the sense of grappling with enormous tasks, but interestingly not going away from where we started, because there are enormous tasks about the shape of what the church is and what its purpose is. But do join me, please, in thanking both of our speakers for their wonderful